Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Nicole Bruin. I'm the Senior Vice President for Government and Public Affairs for the Railway Supply Institute. So you can guess the theme for today's panel is going to be on the supply chain, and more specifically, the U.S. supply chain. So we have a great lineup here for you today to talk about supply chain. Many of the individuals up here today have a lot of experience in dealing with the U.S. Supply chain and the choke points that there, or pinch points, I should say, and choke points that we're seeing in the U.S. Supply chain at the moment. I don't think any of this is brand new to anybody. I think we're all been experiencing it, and it's been in the news quite a bit. But as I said, we have a great panel today. We have Scott Sharon with Alstom, Armin Kick with Siemens. We have, I don't want to mess up your name, Saurav Mittal with Rail One, and David Valenstein with FRA. So thank you all for being here today with us. I thought that we could kick it off with a question for David. And I believe the idea of the panel is that we're going to have questions, but this is designed to promote a conversation. And then all of you at the end will have that 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So I hope that you think about questions that you may want to ask the panel. Maybe. Okay, so David, the first question I have is, what is the Biden administration's vision for a high-speed rail supply chain in America?
Well, as you heard from Mayor Landrieu, the Biden administration's vision is to provide safe, reliable, and efficient passenger rail service to all Americans, including high-speed rail. And as part of the president's Investing in America agenda, we're looking forward to supporting the development of domestic high-speed rail industry. It's a vision for a supplier base of small and large companies and manufacturing sites located in many states across the nation. It's important that investments FRA makes create the promised benefits of those investments and good paying jobs in communities across the country. And that's through the bipartisan infrastructure law. US DOT and FRA are investing in that vision.
Thank you. And I think that this has been obviously those of us that have been in the industry for a while now, harken back to 2008, 2009 with ARA. And we're all seeing this as a continuation of the President Obama's administration, and obviously the president has always been a big supporter in rail. So I think moving forward, the biggest thing from the supplier perspective has always been the continuity and the continued dedicated sources of funding that we've been seeking and asking for over many decades now. So we certainly appreciate the president's support in that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the different pieces of that puzzle? For example, we're talking about infrastructure components when you're looking at the supply chain, right? And I know that there's a plan out there, that one that you're responsible for in terms of getting the domestic supply chain built up, right? More so than it already is. So can you talk about those different pieces of puzzles, the pieces of that puzzle, the infrastructure components, construction equipment, track, and the systems, the power systems, the train sets, all of it?
Well, I'll say a little bit about that. I mean, we've heard a wonderful description from Brightline just a few minutes ago about the components of infrastructure they plan to build. And we know most of what is needed to build a high-speed rail project is available in the U.S. From components of infrastructure like concrete and steel and rebar, and also for power systems and track components like steel rail, concrete ties. However, there are, and we know this, there are specialized high-speed rail components that are not used here today, and they're not produced here today. Some examples of safety and performance critical components of high-speed rail systems may not be available in the US for the projects before us. These are high-tech, like, for example, high-tech aluminum car bodies for trains, advanced train control components like transponders that are placed in the tracks, and components of high-speed switches, really high-speed switches that can allow trains to divert at up to 100 miles an hour. Our goal is to balance policy objectives and make it possible for high-speed rail project sponsors to justify necessary imported items for safe and reliable high-speed rail operation, and over time transition to domestic sources of high-speed rail components and systems. My fellow panelists are from the industry, and they probably have a lot more to tell you about the challenges of scaling up domestic production of specialized components.
So I heard you say building up over time. So, one thing that from the supplier perspective, we've always kind of carried the flag of Buy America, but also understanding that sometimes waivers are necessary. So is the administration willing to look at waivers as these projects are being built out, or is it on a case by case basis?
Well, that really takes me to talking about the notice that we issued. We recognize the risks to high-speed rail project sponsors that come with FRA's 100% Buy America requirements. And we've learned from our experience with the high-speed intercity passenger rail program of a decade ago. So we issued this notice, March 22nd, a notice on domestic sourcing plans and Buy America compliance, to communicate our views and offer a streamlined process for limited necessary waivers before projects are ready, for projects that are ready for construction and before they're selected for funding. It can save valuable time for high-speed rail projects. It's a potential, it's an opportunity. We've tried to make that available. And with the plans, we want to see how much domestic content is in the project as context to understand the justification for any limited waivers. And I can tell you more about that.
Thank you. I think, we talked about what order we wanted to go in as far as the panelists, but I think what I thought we'd do is, since we're on the supply chain, I'm going to kick this one over to Scott Sharon. Scott, you and I have had many conversations over the years around Buy America and the supply chain. For those of you that have been following what Congress is doing, there have been a lot of hearings in the House T&I committee on the supply chain, specifically in the rail subcommittee, more on the freight side. But there was also a supply chain hearing in the highway and transit subcommittee last week, mostly on the highway system. Unfortunately, they didn't focus too much on transit or passenger rail. But I think a lot of the pinch points that we're feeling, yes, they're happening on the freight sector as well. But I think the majority of that has really been on the passenger rail side, especially for the transit agencies. And the House T&I committee they're looking at a tentative markup date of a series of bills on next Tuesday to talk about supply chain issues. And the chairman of the House T&I committee, Sam Graves, a Republican from Missouri, put out an op-ed today in the Washington Times talking about how they're ready to deliver supply chain solutions. And I kind of highlighted a couple of things here, which I think are relevant to our conversation on the panel today. So he's talking about standalone targeted bills that can hopefully attract bipartisan support. And I think, solving the supply chain's problems is really about bipartisan support. If we're getting serious about the federal government doing anything to really solve for some of the problems that we're experiencing. So they're looking at, ways to remove barriers to efficiencies, addressing labor shortage issues, target investments towards supply chain improvements, and more. Also, prioritizing critical supply chain projects for grants and infrastructure funding. This all sounds great on paper, but I'm just wondering exactly what all that means. And I'm wondering, and as we've had these conversations, I think we've all kind of struggled putting our arms around, what does this all mean? What do we need to be thinking? What are you experiencing in the field and seeing? And I don't think we're going to walk away here today saying, aha, we've solved the problem. But I think having a conversation and listening to some of the ideas here in the panel and the audience can hopefully promote some conversations so that when we want to engage with Congress, if there are real solutions, that we have an educated message and that we can help them guide federal policy to helping, correct the supply chain problems that we're experiencing. So Scott, I guess my question then for you is, what is the state of the rail supply chain in passenger rail, and how has this impacted the industry and specifically the OEMs and your component suppliers?
Sure. No, thank you for the question, Nicole. And for those of you who don't know, Nicole is with the rail supply industry, rail supply, okay. And it's a trade association that focuses on the health of the supply chain of the industry. So thank you for the work that you do. It was really surprising to me. There was no rail supplier at that committee here, right? Which tells you a little bit about the health of the supply chain. Buy America is a really good, smart policy that is working particularly well in the rail industry. If you look at passenger rail in the US as a percent of the overall market, it's single digits of the global market. But if you look at our business, we actually maintain two parallel supply chains, one for the global market and one for the US market, solely because of Buy America. John Cohen, my colleague yesterday, was talking a little bit about, two concurrent high-speed programs that are happening right now. One for TGVM or TGV Horizon, which is the new high-speed train that's being introduced in France, and then also the next gen Acela, which we call the Valley of Liberty. Same power car on those trains, two different supply chains. And then also for the passenger vehicles, two separate supply chains because of Buy America. So there's a good policy in place. The question is, how do we maximize it? And the problem historically had always been there wasn't enough funding. You needed the funding in order to be able to have a supply chain, get up and running. The Biden administration has really stepped up in a big way. DOT is really stepping up in a big way to help ensure that money is getting out the door. For me, the real challenge is now is how do we leverage the brain power and the capability within the industry to be maximally effective and efficient in delivering programs? Because we had a scenario before where whether you were a high-speed, sponsor who wanted to develop a project, or you were a transit agency that was running a light rail program, you would apply for a grant, you'd wait to hit the lottery, and then when you hit the lottery, you would start your project. And there was all this activity in the consulting industry, right? Keeping stuff moving along, advancing, spending the money as it became available. Everyone's going to win the lottery within this 2-3 year window. And I don't think that the supply chain is organized in a way to take advantage of all these skill sets to maximally come together and deliver projects. And so I think there needs to be, there needs to be a conversation and a convening of how we bring together, the technology suppliers of the world, also using Siemens's, the consultants of the world, the regulators of the world, of how we recalibrate ourselves to deliver on the promise that Buy America is giving us, and ensure a healthy supply chain going forward.
Just to add on to what Scott is saying, basically we are a small producer. We are not really as big as Alstom or Siemens. We are much lower in the food chain. If I would talk about being a supplier for a high-speed project. Now, normally the issues that we personally face is firstly, the funding for the project. Like right now, this is what the main thing is. Biden administration is doing fantastic job. They're talking about high speed. They're putting money behind high speed. But the main thing is that there has to be a consistency. In order to develop a healthy supply chain for a longer period of time or for a future, you need to have a consistent flow of orders. Now today, for example, my friend over here, Armin, he set up a plant in Carolina. If he's not getting consistent projects where he's delivering his locomotives or his trains, it all comes to a stop. So, every project creates a web of supply chain, a web of employment. And until and unless you're not consistently feeding to this web, your project cost will always be higher. You will never be able to develop a healthy supply chain in the market. So for this, a steady and consistent plan is basically needed to develop a supply chain in America, because we are talking about America. America can develop anything. So, but only thing is the consistency. If we see consistency, we can see the supply chain in this market.
And I agree with what was said before, Scott, and also from your side. We do believe Buy America is a good policy. Siemens has had Buy America in its DNA for over 30 years. When you decide to want to do business here, that's the right thing to do. And it's not just because there's some forces that are driving you there. There's also some very, very natural forces to do that. We're not in the business of shipping very large equipment around the globe. That's expensive. It has all sorts of negative impacts. You do want to get out of foreign exchange risks as much as you can. So there's many, many other drivers that are very, very natural drivers to do things, domestically. So you should not be misled by this idea that everybody would want to do it all completely differently. And then the other aspect that was mentioned as well is obviously the funding levels. The more business that happens, the more business happens close by. So, or as another example, when we try to convince suppliers to enter into the market, it's not really just the Alstoms and the Siemenses that are at issue here, right? It's also the next level suppliers, right? And they have to make a conscientious decision on whether they're going to enter into the market and how that picture looks for them, right? And whether they want to stay in the market, because there's not a year that passes where we lose certain suppliers out of our pool that decide that this isn't for them or this doesn't work for them because, it's not there. So most important in all of this is project funding. And if our customers get their project funded, then these orders keep coming. And it's really the long-term vision of how that market looks, because that's the only way that we can convince the next level suppliers to actually jump in and produce these products. And because the industry is changing and because there's some other needs in the future that we probably will discuss soon, there's going to be other suppliers that are needed. And they have to, again, make this decision on whether they actually set up shop. And that's really the key question.
Just to add on to this, we need to understand that human resource is also a supply chain. When it comes to the overall workability of the project, until and unless there is no human resource development, the supply chain is somehow lagging, because human resource is one of the biggest form of supply chain. And if we talk about these projects and the things in America, if high speed is going ahead, there will be a good amount of human resource supply chain development in the country, which is currently lacking, which sometimes you need engineers from outside to come into and work. And why that should be the case when we have 330 million people living in America, which we can develop in-house. And this is particularly that needs to be also addressed, I would say.
Yeah, that reminds me of an interesting point. So the Railway Supply Institute, we did a study, an economic impact study this year, where we found that when you looked at the total total economic impact, so that's the direct, indirect, induced, the industry contributes $74 billion to the US economy and over 500,000 jobs. So, and that's only 25% rail, right? Because the percentage of the the investment and the employees are more on the freight side. But can you imagine what that would look like if we fully invested in passenger rail and did so over the next 2 decades, what that would look like for our economic impact in the US? So I think there's a really interesting story there. We talk about that quite a bit at our trade association. It's like, if we're talking about human capital, and there's going to be a lot of attrition, right, over the next several years, or we're seeing it already. It's like, how do you attract talent? How do you attract skilled workers, right? And I know that's a common theme that we discuss, but I think that's part of that's an important piece that we all need to be consistently thinking about, is attracting the right talent, but also those skilled workers that you need to be working in, to be pouring the concrete, to be doing the welding, to be doing the type of work that needs to get done in the supply chain floor. So one question I had for you, Saurav, was that, what conditions, and I know that you're interested in opening a facility to help support the project, the Brightline West project. But I'm curious if you don't mind just talking about that the second tier. What kind of conditions would you be looking at as far as continuing to invest in facilities here in the West?
I mean, for us, the ball game is simple. The project comes, we are basically like a circus, When the project comes, we come, set up our tent, we do our show, we show them. And then after that, we lift our tent, we go somewhere else where the project is. It's simple. So for us, I mean, it is very important that a project is coming. And what we see that a G2P partnership, like a government to private partnership, because here we are talking about America. And I would say Brightline is probably the best example I can basically give. The reason being, firstly, they are putting 70% of the fund. They are looking for only 30% for the government to sponsor. They have all the land sorted. So if you're going to say that the project is a go, these guys can get it done in 2 years. This is without a doubt, because we are doing that in India as well. I mean, the game is simple. The money should be secured and the land should be secured. The construction doesn't really take that much of time. And I would say it's a very good model. Like, we started with Make in India. And then after that, Japanese came in with $100 billion funding for the Indian Railways, based on which Indian Railways from the market picked up $500 billion to invest into the railways. Currently, Indian Railways is 1.2 million people working, and they're generating 200,000 jobs each year. Their target is that they want from 1.2% GDP contribution, they wanted to grow it to 10% GDP contribution by 2035. And this is something that I would say that US probably needs right now, because this is definitely going to create a lot of jobs. Secondly, not directly related to railways, but then, like everybody were talking about stations, the retail sector is going to grow, the hospitality sector is going to grow, and everything around that is practically going to grow, So it is a very big chain reaction that you basically get into the economy. And if you're going to talk about personally me, how does that look like? If there is a consistent flow of projects and consistent flow of investment into the high-speed sector, I probably see that by 2030 or 2035, I'm employing at least 250, 300 people. Those are the people out of which 100 people will be probably in the office and the rest will be all on the field. So, and these are not just any people, these are skilled people. These are the people I need to train to be professional in that sector. and then comes the educational part. Because when you are growing into that, then you get into more research and development. Then you're creating new resources. Then you're adapting to the geography of the country. So it is all very correlated. It is a very long supply chain that you end up developing then in the end.
Yeah, and it's that induced network that you're talking about when you build up those stations and you build up that commerce area, right? That you're creating more jobs, and I think that's an important piece that when we tell the story about why we need to be investing in rail, sometimes that gets lost.
Because just an example, for example, the Brightline train is going to go through Victorville. Practically, Victorville is an industrial town close to Barstow. Nobody really actually goes and stays in Victorville, though I would say it's a very scenic place in the Baja California, but nobody actually wants to go there. But when it is accessible by LA downtown in such a short time, trust me, there will be so much more commuting happening in that area. That is itself, which gives an opportunity for people in Victorville to go and work in Rancho Cucamonga. Or people in Rancho Cucamonga find a better opportunity in Victorville or maybe in Vegas, So the mobility factor, I think this is the reason why India is focusing more on railways right now, because we are 1.3 billion people. If they're sitting in their own location, there will never be a job creation. So the mobility of one person to go 80 kilometers traveling in India is taking 3 hours, 4 hours. But if a train comes, the person who's staying there in 1 hour can get to the city center and create more job opportunities.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to move things over to Armin. So I know Siemens recently opened a new facility in North Carolina, and I guess my question for you, just thinking about that new investment, is manufacturing high-speed trains here in the U.S. In a way that's fully sourced here in the U.S. And I think it's something. The question is, what are we able to do now? Can we do that now? Are we there? And what would it take us to get all the way there if we're not there? And I'm kind of setting you up because I know the answer, but I want to.
Yeah, thank you for the comment on Lexington. Obviously, we're very excited to open a second rail manufacturing plant in North Carolina. We do that because of the outlook in the market. Again, what I said previously, we have very large orders to fill, and those are very long-running contracts. And with that in backlog, we can make a decision like that, to invest even more. We're investing $220 million into this new plant, and we will be building product there, starting next year. So that's a very exciting move for us, and we need to do this capacity expansion because we have very large orders. Our factory in Sacramento will keep doing exactly what it's doing today, but we needed, more capacity, and we also need a lot of that capacity is going on the East Coast, so it reduces our transportation costs a lot to produce there. So that's how a decision like that gets made, and it is because of longevity, because of some of these funding models that are actually working now, and because there is long-running contracts, we can do a decision like that. So now switching over to high-speed rail. So currently, no 220-mile-an-hour high-speed trains are being manufactured in this country. That's a fact, okay? And the fact is also that high-speed trains are a little bit different from conventional trains. So there's some speed-dependent factors, and so some components are affected by speed, some are not. The ones that are not at issue here. Seats and interiors is pretty similar to an intercity train, so that's not under discussion here. But there is some very sophisticated manufacturing techniques involved in building high-speed trains, and that creates a challenge also because the market demand here isn't huge, right? Again, if this market was taking off at hundreds of units of trains, it would be a different story, but it clearly isn't. So there is a challenge on some of these things like friction stir welding, car bodies, and things of that nature, and that is dependent. So just to maybe explain that a little bit more, when the high-speed trains are definitely different because, as you know, energy goes up in the square. So trains that go faster have a lot more energy that you have to deal with. So you deal with that by reducing weight, very good aerodynamics, and braking systems to handle all that. That's being done every day of the week in all of these systems out there. That's all known, but it brings some new technology and some new aspects into the game that has to be remembered. And then on top of that, we're not just designing, or we're not just taking a train from here to there. We're actually designing a US high-speed train per the Tier 3 rules that are on the books. So we obviously have to enhance what's out there to be compliant with the American rules. And that's a good thing. And we've been doing that for a long time as well. So that's what plays into this. And from that vantage point, there's also a speed to market factor, right? As was presented before by Brightline West, if you want to do things, it's good to do them fast. And to do that, again, speed comes into play, and technology transfer actually takes a while as well. So that all, summarizing all that, what we think is there needs to be this glide path to building everything here, right? And we're fully committed to that. You know, as I said, we're all for Buy America, and you know, we're going to get there. And if the market develops in a certain way, it happens naturally anyways. But to start it off, there should be some concessions made. What we, for instance, think is it's very good to develop this technology. It needs the center of competence involved in this technology, right? Because we have very smart engineers at Siemens, and others have as well. We can do everything that we do here in the market, but we're adding a new piece to it. So we need to involve our center of competence people. And we think it's very good to manufacture and debug the prototypes in a place where this is naturally done. And it also brings down the speed in which you can enter the market like it's required for Brightline West by doing some of this overseas and then bringing the technology here. And by the way, we got a very good example when we built the ACS64 electric locomotives for the Northeast Corridor. We didn't have to do car bodies here. It was not a requirement. It was not in the requirement, but we did it anyways. But we did it. We built the first 10 there. We brought those over, and then we taught the people here how to do it on the next sets. That's a transition into doing Buy America here. And that's what we think works very well. It's also an example that has been globally used when Siemens initiated the high-speed boom in China. That's exactly how it was done. The first 6 trains were built in Germany and brought over. The rest of the 60 was then done in China. And from there, it obviously took off in great numbers.
So if I can pick up on Armin's point, you're absolutely right about tier 3. And, you know, I give the FRA in particular a huge amount of credit for the advisory committee that they ran, the Rail Safety Advisory Committee, to allow that to happen, right? So many of the people in the room know there's a TSI specification. It's a standard globally. And the FRA had the wisdom to realize that, you know, in order to be able to bring technologies in globally, we had to find a way within a uniquely American framework, and respecting that, allow us to be able to benefit with a smoother transition. And so over a 10-year period, you know, a group of about 60 of us, right, we're involved in that, and now have the current tier 3 specification. You know, the current Amtrak trains are being built to tier 3. They'll go 186 miles per hour as is, except for the infrastructure. The reason they only go 186 is there's a three-phase transformer because there's 3 voltages on the Northeast Corridor as opposed to 1. And we reduce the gearing. You know, it's kind of like a manual transmission car, right? If you're in 1st or 3rd gear, you have really quick acceleration, but a minimal top speed. If you're in 5th or 6th gear, right, you go a lot faster top speed, but you don't have the acceleration. So, you know, we reduce the gearing on the train, but you change those things, it can go 200 miles per hour plus. The thing that really, I guess, I think we're missing right now, and I hear a lot of this coming from all different, you know, areas in the high-speed spaces. It's not just about the train. You know, it's delighted that you're up here with us to talk about a different aspect. The high-speed train technology exists. There's 150 line items that FRA published back in 2015, right? That had to be met. You know, when we had to apply for waivers. It can be done. It's not easy. It's painful to build a supply chain, but it can be done. But when you look at the track, and there's no UIC compliant track that's made in the US, we'll figure it out. We'll look at wheel flange angles and rail kineticity and get into all sorts of subjects to make that work. Systems integration, deep understanding of systems integration in the US doesn't really have root in the rail industry in the US. We've never really had to do it. And so how the signaling and the communications and the rail and the train and the tolerances of how everything fits together, we're going to figure that out together, right? It's going to be sloppy. It'll be messy. We'll figure it out. You know, it gets back to the point that was made about the brain power, right? We need to recognize there's the technology piece, not just trains everywhere. We need to recognize there's a human capital piece, and how do we make that work? You know, and I guess the last thing I'd point out is we have a unique moment of leverage in this country. You know, I lived in China for 4 years, and I'm a little hesitant to hold up China as a model for something to do, and you know, because I know there's a natural aversion to that, especially right now in this, you know, political moment that we're in. But when I was in China, I was not with Alstom, I was with a different company. I saw every multinational in the world show up on the Chinese footstep and invest. They built factories, they transferred technology, they chased the business because the dollars were there. We need to have courage in the US and we need to recognize the leverage that we have. We're going to spend this money. We need to demand that the world come to us, invest here, transfer the technology, and give us the tools that we need and train our smart people in technologies that we've never had the benefit because we've been ignoring for a little while, so that we're sustainable and we can grow from there. If we don't do that, we're going to miss this opportunity, and I hate to see that happen.
Yeah, and I think that the window is shrinking a little bit for every day that the clock ticks on. But
Yep.
just given where we are in the political scenario, that will definitely play a part, but
I also think that the market is really ready for high-speed rail now.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we've been at this for a while, and we've had a lot of time to think about it, and we've thought about it very hard, and the market is really ready. I mean, we're ready. If these projects get funded, they can be built. And we also believe that we should leapfrog ahead. America shouldn't be a place where we copycat something in that already exists somewhere else. You know, America is all about bigger and better. So we also think we should have the bigger and better high-speed train. And that comes with a number of facts. You know, you want top speed, certainly. America needs to prove that we're doing top speed. It comes with unparalleled convenience. I spoke about that yesterday. We're replacing, you know, a commuter type aircraft seat in B, yeah, a B seat with a high-speed train. That's a totally different way to travel. It's very, very civilized to travel that way. Or we're replacing what was mentioned before, also standing in traffic on I-15 with a train swooping by with amenities. So that it's just a much, much better way to travel. And with that, you know, we should just, ADA is another aspect that comes to mind in this. You know, I think we should be enormously proud of what this country does on ADA. This is really better than anywhere else on the globe. ADA is a huge difference. And, you know, nobody's getting younger, and you actually realize there's huge benefit in this. And giving people space and having a train that you can, you know, provide the same amenities to, you know, people that cannot do that today is a very, very large thing in our mind. And the way that a person in a wheelchair can use the train and go to the cafe car like everybody else is huge in our mind. And that's what America stands for. And there's no steps when you get on the train. It's all level boarding, and you can get along the entire train in a wheelchair. And we think that's hugely important. And that's why I'm saying high-speed rail in America needs to be bigger and better. We need to leapfrog what the other guys are doing. And we're going to have an even better system with even more convenience and more comfort for the users. And you built this for decades ahead. We're not building high-speed rail for really our generation. We're building it for the next generation and all of that. And when you set that up correctly at the beginning, you have a really marvelous system that you have that you replicate in other corridors, and you get a national system with an extremely high standard. And when you set it up that way, it will be fabulous.
yeah, it's going to be quite a legacy if we do this the right way. Well, we're running out of time, so I think we may have the opportunity for just one or two questions from the audience, if there are any. We've got a couple microphones over here. So just raise your hand if you have a question for the panel. You got two right here.
Thank you, Andrea Giulicin. I think it's very, very interesting because we have a very short time to create a system, because a high-speed rail is a system. It's not just train, it's not just infrastructure. We have 5 years, because if Brightline West, we will have Brightline West 2028, it means 5 years. And to create a system in 5 years, I follow high-speed rail in Spain, Italy, in China, and so on, and Korea. It's not easy at all. So the needs of standardization for myself, it's clearly a very important point. But at the same time, we know that also there's some specificity of the country. So how we can do that standardization with some specific requirement here, and to make this in just 5 years?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So look, I lived in China for 4 years, and they were able to do major infrastructure projects, particularly in the rail industry, in about a third of the time that it takes in the US, right? General rule of thumb. And it happened for a couple of reasons. One is they chose the right companies with the willingness to adapt their ways of working, right? You look at high speed around the world, and I have this conversation with my colleagues all the time. They're very structured. The round peg goes in the round hole, the square peg goes in the square hole. If something is out of order, it takes them a while to recalibrate and figure out how to work. You need to have the right team of individuals and companies that when they see a challenge, they instantly shift into problem solving mode. You're working 20 hours a day, right? For the Brightline team and their schedule, they're going to be working 20 hours a day for however many years it's taking them, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, right? They have to get that done. And you need to grab as many existing pieces that are already working and proven as possible. If everything is new, you're done. And you need to look at specifically the elements that are going to have the most, to your point, systems integration involved. If those two pieces are new, you're done. You're going to try and build labs and put things into a lab environment and test it and see if it works. It's always different than the field. So hire the right team and the right people with the right attitude, grab as many existing pieces as you possibly can, and recognize you're going to be working 20 hours a day until the project's done.
And second thing, just to add to him, is firstly, the funding for the entire thing, if it is secured, if you know that this is the fund which is available and you have all the fund for the project, and you have all the land and property and the clearances for the project, it can be done.
And just to add on, we're not starting from scratch. Luckily, the European Union has spent a lot of effort on this whole standardization approach because they had the unique challenge that, every national railroad went off on their own with their own signaling system and their own standards and everything else. And then when you then want to build a transnational network where the trains actually go from everywhere to everywhere, which is, by the way, where the people want to go, then you have to get that genie back in the bottle, which isn't easy. But through that whole process, there's been a huge body of knowledge developed on standardization and on rules and how to do that. And obviously the world can use that toolbox, and that's our strong recommendation, to use that toolbox very effectively and use the standardization approach that comes with that so that systems can work together and the competition continues and you're not locked in with one supplier forever, which is another huge problem. And so that all can be done. So the information is there. We have to obviously build a lot of that up in the US, but the projects will be able to do that, and the industry can fulfill those requirements.
There was one other question. You just might want to stand up in just in the interest of time unless she's got it. Okay. No worries.
More of a thought really that we speak about learning from high-speed rail systems around, but I think there's a fantastic opportunity in the US to specifically learn around the supply chain opportunity that there is. So really what I know, but in the UK, high-speed 2 actually was routed through a tie sleeper factory, so we had to demolish the tie sleeper factory in order to make space, obviously, with the components that was there for the first place. So some lessons learned and things like that about the whole supply chain piece. And it's really just an opportunity that, the cost benefits that could come from maximising the economies of scale and getting that whole supply chain to much good. Just taking that sort of learning from around the world, I think is such a great opportunity. So it's like more of a
We're right on time. Enjoy lunch, everyone. Thank you.